Mormonism Unveiled by John T. Lee. Read by Paul Martin, 2019. Copyright Paul Martin's Fine Films and Audio Books. Chapter 12. Matters of Peculiar Interest at Nauvoo. Upon my return home, I found my family well. Work on the temple was progressing finely, and every effort was being made to push it ahead. About this time, John C. Bennett came on a visit to see the prophet, and soon after joined the church. At that time he wielded quite an influence in government affairs. He grew in the graces of the prophet and became his right-hand man. He endeavoured in connection with Stephen A. Douglas to obtain a charter for the city of Nauvoo. Bennett organised the Nauvoo Legion and was elected Major General. Through his influence, backed by Douglas, arms were obtained for the Legion for the government. A Freemasons' lodge and the privileges of Masonry were extended to the Legion. Judge Cleveland of Springfield, Illinois, was very friendly and frequently visited the prophet. A fine lodge was built in Nauvoo, and many were admitted as members. The brothers, Joseph and Hiram Smith, held high positions in the brotherhood. I here became a member of the order and received 3 degrees. The institution flourished during our stay in Nauvoo and was frequently visited by Grand Worshipful Master from Springfield, and lectures were had and a library established. I was librarian of the order. I was also wharf master of the city and held the position of major in the Nauvoo Legion and commanded the escort in the 5th Infantry. I was made the general clerk and reader for the 70s and issued the laws to that body. I held the office of a 70 and was collector of the delinquent military tax. The same fall, I was appointed a committee with Brigham Young as councillor to build a hall for the 70s, the upper story to be used for the priesthood, and the council of 50. Previous to my being appointed on the committee, 2 committees had been appointed but had accomplished nothing, and we commenced without $1. My plan was to build it by shares of the value of $5 each. Hiram Smith, the patriarch, told me that he would give the patriarchal blessing to any that laboured on the foundation of the building. The 70s numbered about 490 men. I was to create the material, that is, I would watch, and when I could get a contract to take out lumber from the river as rafts would land at the city, I would take common labouring men and the portion of the labour that we got for our pay. We would pile up for the building. In this way we got all the lumber needed. The brick we made ourselves and boated the wood to burn them, and our lime from the island. In the month of March 1844, we had the building up on the west side, nearly 2 stories high. One day, when the wall was built up 9 feet high and 45 feet long, and was of coarse green, a tornado came that night and blew the wall down, breaking columns and joists below, doing a damage of several $1,000. I was inclined to be down in the lip, but Brigham Young laughed at me and said it was the best omen in the world. It showed that the devil was mad and knew that the 70 would receive the blessings of God in that house. And as they were special witnesses to the nations of the earth, they would make his kingdom quake and tremble, that when Noah was building the ark, he was mobbed 3 times, but he persevered, and finally they said, "Let the damned old fool alone and see what he will accomplish." Just so with you, double your diligence and put her up again. If you do not, you will lose many a blessing. I went to work again, with as many men as could work to advantage. We threw the wall down flat and commenced a new one, another brick thicker than the former. I borrowed 50,000 bricks and made them and returned them when the weather was fine. By the 1st of May, we had the hall closed in. I must now leave the building of the hall for other matters. During the winter, Joseph the prophet set a man by the name of Sidney Hay Jacobs to select from the old Bible such scriptures as pertained to polygamy or celestial marriage, and to write it in pamphlet form and to advocate that doctrine. This he did as a feeler among the people to pave the way for celestial marriage. This, like all other notions, met with opposition, while a few favoured it. The excitement among the people became so great that the subject was laid before the prophet. No one was more opposed to it than was his brother Hiram, who denounced it as from beneath. Joseph saw that it would break up the church should he sanction it. So he denounced the pamphlet through the Wasp, a newspaper published at Nauvoo by E. Robinson, as a bundle of nonsense and trash. He said if he had known its contents, he would never have permitted it to be published, while at the same time other confidential men were advocating it on their own responsibility. Joseph himself said on the stand that should he reveal the will of God concerning them, that they, pointing to President W. Marks, P.P. Pratt and others, would shed his blood. He urged them to surrender themselves to God instead of rebelling against the stepping stone of their exaltation. In this way, he worked upon the feelings and minds of the people, until they feared that the anger of the Lord would be kindled against them, and they insisted upon knowing the will of heaven concerning them. But he dared not proclaim it publicly, so it was taught confidentially to such as were strong enough in the faith to take another step. About the same time, the doctrine of sealing for an eternal state was introduced, and the saints were given to understand that their marriage relations with each other were not valid, that those who had solemnised the rites of matrimony had no authority of God to do so, that the true priesthood was taken from the earth with the death of the apostles and inspired men of God, that they were married to each other only by their own covenants, and that if their marriage relations had not been productive of blessings and peace, and they felt it oppressive to remain together, they were at liberty to make their own choice, as much as if they had not been married. That it was a sin for people to live together and raise or beget children in alienation from each other. There should exist an affinity between each other, not a lustful one, as that can never cement that love and affection that should exist between a man and his wife. I will here mention that Orson Hyde and W. W. Phelps turned against Joseph in Missouri, and forsook him in time of peril and danger, and even testified against him in the courts. After the troubles were over, and Joseph was again in place in the midst of the saints. They both wished to be restored to fellowship and standing in the church, confessing their faults. Joseph laid the case before the church and said that if God would forgive them, he ought to, and would do so and give them another chance. With tears he moved that we would forgive them and receive them back into fellowship. He sent Elder O. Hyde and John E. Page to Jerusalem and to the land of Palestine to dedicate that land for the gathering of the Jews. Report said that Hyde's wife, with his consent, was sealed to Joseph for an eternal state, but I do not assert the fact. I also understood that Brigham Young's wife was sealed to Joseph. After the death of Joseph, Brigham Young told me that Joseph's time on earth was short and that the Lord allowed him privileges that we could not have. A difference arose between Joseph and William Law, his second counsellor, on account of Law's wife. Law said that the prophet proposed making her his wife, and she so reported to her husband. Law loved his wife and was devoted to her, as she was an amiable and handsome woman, and he did not feel like giving her up to another man. He exposed the prophet, and from that time became his enemy. His brother, Wilson Law, sided with him. They were Canadians and wealthy and influential men. They, in connection with Foster and Higby, who were in the wane in the faith, established a paper at Nauvoo called the Expositor, in which they took about the same position that the Salt Lake Daily Tribune does. They set the prophet up without mercy. They soon got after Brigham for trying to influence Martha Brotherton to be sealed to Joseph. Her father found it out and helped to expose them, which made it rather hot for them. The next move of the prophet and his friends was to get the city council to pass an ordinance declaring the Expositor to be a nuisance and also Higby's grocery, unless they would close them up. John C. Bennett became suspected and fears were entertained that he would join the faction. He was accused of selling offices in the military organisation to certain men who would help him win the good graces of some of his young sisters, and that he became intimate with Orson Pratt's wife while Pratt was on a mission, that he built her a fine frame house and lodged with her and used her as his wife. Fearing that Bennett would assail the character of the prophet, I brought him before the city council and had him make a statement certifying that he knew nothing derogatory to the character of the prophet and that his behaviour was that of a gentleman and a man of God. After this, Bennett was hauled up and dealt with and severed from the church. He said that the prophet gave him permission to do as he had done with Mrs. Pratt. Joseph said Bennett was guilty of adultery, but that as a matter of policy he had not exposed him until after Bennett had made his statement. Previous to this time, the prophet had written a letter to Martin von Buren, wishing to know his views in regard to the grievances and wrongs of the Mormon people, should he be elected president. He replied that he believed their cause was just and that Congress had no right to interfere, that it was a state matter, and was left to the executive. The prophet addressed another letter to William H. Harrison on the same subject. His answer was but little more satisfactory. He then drew up a statement of his own on the power and policy of the government. A convention was called, and the prophet was nominated as a candidate for the presidency. He set forth his views in the Nauvoo Neighbour, a newspaper formerly known as the Wasp. He stated that if the people would elect him president, it would be the salvation of the nation, but if otherwise, the Union would soon be severed. That the two political parties would continue to influence the people until it would end in civil war, in which all nations would take part, and this nation would be broken up. At this convention, the elders were assigned missions to different states. I was sent to stump the state of Kentucky with 10 elders to assist me. Brigham Young said to me, "You had better shut up the 70s hall and obey, perhaps the last call of the prophet." Things looked rather squally before I left, and but little prospect of growing better. I left Nauvoo on the 4th of May, 1844, with greater reluctance than I had on any previous mission. It was hard enough to preach the gospel without purse or scrip, but it was nothing compared to offering a man with the reputation that Joseph Smith had to the people as a candidate for the highest gift of the nation. I would 1,000 times rather been shut up in jail than to have taken the trip, but I dared not refuse. About 100 of us took the steamer Osprey for St. Louis. Our mission was understood by all the passengers on board. I was not long waiting until the subject was brought up. I had made up my mind to banish all fear and overcome timidity. I made the people believe that I felt highly honoured to electioneer for a prophet of God, that it was a privilege that few men enjoyed in these days. I endeavoured to make myself agreeable by mixing with the passengers on the steamer. I told them that the prophet would lead both candidates from the start. There was a large crowd on the boat, and an election was proposed. Judges and clerks were appointed, and a vote taken. The prophet received a majority of 75 out of 125 votes polled. This created a tremendous laugh, and we kept it up till we got to St. Louis. Here, the most of us took the steamer Mermaid. The change of steamers afforded me a new field of labour. Here I met a brother of General Atchison, one of the commanders of the militia that served against the church at Far West. He became very much interested in me, and when we parted at Smithfield, Kentucky, he invited me to go home with him and preach in his neighbourhood. My destination being Frankfurt, I could not accept his invitation. I went to Lexington by way of Georgetown, lecturing as I went. I finally went to the capital, put up a hotel, and endeavoured to hire the State House to speak in, but found it engaged. My funds were low, though my hotel bill was $4 a day. After 3 days' trial, I hired the courthouse. The people said that no Mormon had ever been able to get a hearing, though several had attempted to do so. When evening came, I had to light up the house and ring the bell. Elder S.B. Frost assisted me. Soon the hall was filled with none but juveniles, from 10 to 15 years of age. I understood the trick. They supposed I would leave. But to their surprise I arose and said I was glad to see them out in such great numbers, that I knew they had good parents, or they would not be here, that if they would take seats and be quiet we would sing them some of our Mormon songs. Elder Frost was a charming singer. We sang 2 or 3 songs. Our juvenile hearers seemed paralysed. I then knelt down and prayed. By this time the hall was crowded with men, and I begged them not to crowd my little friends out. I then spoke about an hour and a half upon the constitutional rights of American citizens. I spoke of the character of the Southern people, that they were noted for their kind and generous treatment of strangers, in particular, but that I feared from the treatment I'd received that I'd missed my way in Kentucky. My sires were of Southern birth. My father was a relative of the revolutionary Lee of Virginia. My uncle was from Lexington, Kentucky. That I came a stranger into their midst, and I felt confident that the right of speech would be extended to us, that we were ministers of the gospel, travelling without purse or scrip, dependent upon the generosity of the people for food and raiment, nor did we preach for hire, that if they wished, we would remain there and lecture, and if it met the approbation of the people, they could have the gospel preached to them without money and without price. The first man that spoke was a saddler. He said he was a poor man, but we were welcome to his house, giving the street and number. About 20 more responded in like manner, among them some of the most wealthy men of the county. We went home with a rich farmer and continued our labours, having more calls than we could fill. We were sent for by a rich planter who lived about 20 miles away. I was anxious to extend our labours as much as it was advisable. On our way to the planter's, we found it difficult to obtain dinner. The Orthodox people did not like to associate with Mormons. I finally asked them to direct me to where some infidel or gambler lived. They wanted to know what on earth I wanted of them. I replied, to get something to eat, that they were too liberal-minded to turn a stranger away from their door, that the Saviour ate with publicans and sinners for the very reason that we do, for the religious scribes and Pharisees would not feed him. They pointed us to the next house, where we went and were kindly received and entertained. The gentleman informed us that he belonged to no church, but that he had an interest in a church, and said we were welcome to preach there. He went and made an appointment for us to preach. We preached there, and were received with the greatest kindness. I soon began to baptise, and calls came in on every side, when the papers brought us the news of the assassination of the prophet Joseph and his brother Hiram. We returned immediately to Frankfort. As I expected the elders there to learn what to do, we retired to Maple Grove on the Kentucky River and kneeled in prayer and asked the Lord to show us whether or not these reports were true. I was the mouth in prayer, but received nothing definite in answer to my prayer. I told the elders to follow their own impressions, and if they wished to do so, to return to Nauvoo. Each of them made his way back. I went and spent the evening with a Mr. Snow. He claimed to be a cousin of Erastus Snow, who was favourable to us. We spent the evening talking over the reported deed. The next morning, about 10 o'clock, my mind was drawn out in prayer. I felt as though the solemnity of eternity was resting upon me. A heavenly hallowed influence fell upon me and continued to increase until I was electrified from head to foot. I saw a large personage enter the door and stand before me. His apparel was as white as the driven snow, and his countenance as bright as the noonday sun. I felt paralysed and was speechless and motionless. It remained with me but a moment, then receded back out of the door. This bright being's influence drew me from my chair and led me south about 300 yards into a plot of clover and blue grass, and stood over a persimmon tree which afforded a pleasant shade. I fell prostrate upon my face upon the grass. While here I saw Joseph the prophet and Hiram his brother the patriarch, and their wounds by which they had been assassinated. This personage spoke to me in a soft, low voice and said that the prophet and patriarch had sealed their testimony with their blood, that our mission was like that of the apostles, and our garments were clear of the blood of the nation, that I should return to Nauvoo and wait until power was granted us from on high, that as the priesthood fell upon the apostle Peter, so should it rest with the 12 apostles of the church for the present. And thus the vision closed, and I gradually returned back to my native element. Rising up, I looked at my watch and saw that I had been there an hour and a quarter. Returning to the house, my friend Snow asked me if I was ill. I replied in the negative. I said I was very pale, that he saw my countenance change while I sat in my chair, that when I went out of the door it seemed as though every drop of blood had left me or been changed. I then told him that the reports in the papers were true, and the two saints, the prophet and the patriarch, were no more. I asked him to take me to the landing, as I wished to take the evening packet, as my labours were done in this county for the present. He importuned me so hard that I told him what I had seen. He saddled a horse for me and one for himself, and we started in company with several others for the landing. When we were about to start on the steamer, Mr. Steele, a brother of the captain, introduced me to the captain. About 8 persons demanded baptism, but I could not stop, but advised them to come to Nauvoo. Among them was my friend Snow. I had a cabin passage free. When I reached Nauvoo, the excitement was at the highest point. Mormonism Unveiled by John D. Lee, 1877. Read by Paul Martin, 2019. Copyright Paul Martin's Fine Films and Audio Books. Chapter 13. The Death of Joseph Smith, son of Brigham Young's crimes. Joseph Smith, the prophet, and Hiram, his brother, were assassinated on the 24th day of June, 1844, at Carthage, Illinois, about 20 miles from Nauvoo, while under the pledged faith of Governor Ford of Illinois. Governor Ford had promised them protection if they would stand trial and submit to the judgment of the court. By his orders, the Nauvoo Greys were to guard the jail while the prisoners awaited a trial. The mob was headed by Williams and Sharp, editors of the Nauvoo Signal. When they approached the jail, the guard made no resistance but fell back. Stephen Markham, who had been to visit the prisoners an hour or so before they were killed, gave Joseph an Allen revolver. A part of the mob rushed upstairs to the inner door of the prison and burst it open and attempted to enter. Dr. Richards parried off the bayonets with his heavy cane. Joseph reached out his hand and fired off his 6 shots at the crowd and wounded several mortally. Hiram, who was trying to brace against the door, received a shot in the face near the nose. He said, "I am a dead man," and fell. John Taylor received a shot, but fortunately it struck his watch, which saved his life. These 4 were in the prison. Taylor, however, received another shot and fell. Joseph left the door, sprang through the window and cried out, "O Lord, my God, is no help for the widow's son?" As he sprang from the window, pierced with several balls, the crowd then left the door and ran around to the windows. Dr. Richards covered Taylor with a straw bed. Several shots were fired at the bed, some of which cut his legs. Dr. Richards looked out of the window on the scene and had several balls pass through his clothing but received no injury. After Joseph fell, he was set up against the well curb and shot again. A young man named Bogg rolled up his sleeves and with a knife attempted to cut off his head. At this instant, many of the bystanders report that a flash of light encircled the prophet and the man who was advancing to cut off his head fell back. They all seemed frightened and fled after perpetrating the horrid deed. A runner was sent to Nauvoo to acquaint Governor Ford with what had been done. The governor was terror-stricken, as it endangered his life, he being alone, without a guard, and at the mercy of the Mormons. Had they chosen to take advantage of him while he was in Nauvoo, Governor Ford advised them to be quiet and promised that he would see that their murderers should be prosecuted. He gave the Mormons a company of troops to go and bring out their dead friends to Nauvoo. They were placed in rough oak plank boxes and brought to the city. There was great lamentation and mourning over them among the people. Joseph was a man dearly loved by the saints and blessed with direct revelation from God, and was an honourable, generous, high-minded man. The remains of the prophet and his brother were laid in a sepulchre made of stone. The rough boards, which once enclosed them, were sawed in pieces and distributed among their friends, many of whom had canes made of the pieces, with a lock of the hair of the prophet set in the top of them, and those canes are kept as sacred relics to this day. But I must go back and speak of the cause of their arrest. While I was in Kentucky, the printing press and the grocery of Higby and Foster were declared nuisances and ordered to be destroyed. The owners refused to comply with the decision of the city council, and the mayor ordered the press and type destroyed, which was done. The owner of the grocery employed John Eagle, a regular bully, and others to defend him. As the police entered, or attempted to enter, Eagle stood in the door and knocked 3 of them down. As the third one fell, the prophet struck Eagle under the ear and brought him sprawling to the ground. He then crossed Eagle's hands and ordered them to be tied, saying that he could not see his men knocked down while in the line of their duty without protecting them. This raised the ire of those men, Higby and Foster and others, and they got out writs for the arrest of Joseph and others, and laid their grievances before the governor. Joseph, knowing the consequences of such a move, concluded to leave for the Rocky Mountains and lay out a country where the saints would not be molested. He crossed over into Iowa with a few faithful friends with him. These friends begged him to return and stand his trial, that the Lord had always delivered him and would again. He told them that if he returned, he would be killed, but that if he went away, he would save his life and the church would not be hurt, that he would look out a new country for them, that the governor had also advised him to do so. These old grannies then accused him of cowardice and told him that Christ had said he would never leave his brethren in trouble. He then asked if his Emma wished him to return. They answered yes. He then said it was all light before him and darkness behind him, but he would return, though he felt like a sheep being led to the slaughter. The following day, he crossed the river again in Illinois. He kissed his mother in particular and told her that his time had come and that he would seal his testimony with his blood. He advised his brother Hiram not to go with him, that he would be a comfort to the churches when he, the prophet, should be gone. Hiram said, "No, my brother, I have been with you in life and will be with you in death." The prophet then called General Dunham and had some private talk with him and started for the jail at Carthage. Dunham said that the prophet requested him to take his command and ambush it in a grove near Carthage and watch the movements of the crowd. But Dunham dared not go contrary to the orders of the governor. He might have gone in the night time, as he knew that Joseph feared treachery. About this time, the settlements on Bear Creek and at Great Plains had a difficulty with the outsiders, and the settlements were broken up and the settlers driven to Nauvoo. The Mormons sought redress under the law. The sheriff tried to suppress the riot by a posse, but could not get a posse from the outsiders, and he was obliged to summon them from the Mormons. This made him unpopular and endangered his life, which rendered him powerless. Governor Ford tried to bring to justice those who had assaulted the Smiths, but public opinion was against him, and the mass of people objected. Hence, nothing was done. Some of the leaders in the horrid deed were members of the legislature, and though the disturbance was partially quelled, still the feeling of enmity continued to exist until the final breakup of the church. Every exertion was made to push forward the completion of the temple at Nauvoo. Before proceeding further, we must learn who was to be the successor of the prophet to lead the church. It was then understood among the saints that young Joseph was to succeed his father, and that right justly belonged to him. Joseph the prophet had bestowed that right upon him by ordination, but he was too young at the time to fill the office and discharge its solemn duties. Someone must fill the place until he had grown to a more mature age. Sidney Rigdon set up his claim, he being the second counsellor to the prophet. Rigdon had a few backers for his claims. A man by the name of Strong, who had been writing for the prophet, set up his claim to the office by forging an appointment from Joseph. Time passed on until the 12 got in from their missions and a conference was held, and the several claimants came forward with their claims. Sidney Rigdon was the first who appeared upon the stand. He had been considered rather in the background for some time previous to the death of the prophet. He made but a weak claim. Strong did not file any. Just then Brigham Young arose and roared like a young lion, imitating the style and voice of Joseph the prophet. Many of the brethren declared that they saw the mantle of Joseph fall upon him. I myself at the time imagined that I saw and heard a strong resemblance to the prophet in him, and felt he was the man to lead us until Joseph's legal successor should grow up to manhood, when he should surrender the presidency to the man who held the birthright. After that time, if he continued to claim and hold the position, he could not be considered anything else than a usurper, and his acts would not meet the approbation of heaven. Hence the course of Brigham Young has been downward ever since. As soon as he got the reins of government in his hands, he swore that he would never suffer an officer to serve a writ on or arrest him, as they had Joseph, that he would send them across lots to hell, that dark and gloomy road whence no traveller ever returned. At that time I lived on Warsaw Street, about 1/2 mile east of the temple. He wished me to remove near to him, as I was one of the guards that were assigned to guard him. I had quite a comfortable brick house and lot, all in fine order on Warsaw Street. He told me to let him have my property on Warsaw Street, and he would buy me a house on the flat, nearer to him. I did so, and he brought out Samuel D. Frost and sent him on a mission to Kentucky, where I had been labouring, taking his family with him. He had a nice little frame house. I moved into it and had it finished on the inside and made quite comfortable. Brigham, at that time, was living in a little log house, but was preparing to build a brick house. I renewed my labours on the Hall of the 70s and finished it in grand style. It was then dedicated, and the different quorums all had a picnic party in it, beginning with the first quorum, consisting of 77 men to each quorum. Brigham said this hall would be a credible building in London. He called upon me to organise all the young men into quorums of 70 and keep the records for them. He appointed me general clerk and recorder of the 70s, and through me were to be issued the licenses of the quorums. This was to be my compensation for my services. Joseph Young was the senior president over all the quorums. My responsibility increased daily. I was offered the position of senior president, I to select my 6 councillors, and my quorum of 70, but I declined as I did not want the responsibility. I held then all the offices I could fill. Having finished the hall, I was offered, or rather had a mission, to build Joseph Young, the head president of the 70s, a neat brick dwelling. Calling upon the 70s to assist me, I soon mustered all the help that was necessary, and made brick enough to build me a large dwelling house, including my other buildings. It was 90 feet front, 2.5 stories high, with a good cellar. By the middle of July 1845, I had both houses, the one for Joseph Young and the one for myself, finished, ready for painting. During the winter of 1844 to 45, a man by the name of Stanley took up a school teaching the use of the broadsword. At the expiration of his term, I opened 3 schools of 50 scholars each in the same exercise. I gave 13 lessons in each school, receiving $2 from each scholar. This made me $600. I received 25 cents for each licence that I issued. With these means, I purchased paints and oils to finish my dwelling house. I became very popular among the saints, and many of them donated labour and materials for my dwelling house. I had a handsome enclosure with fine orchard, well of water, house finished, and grained from top to bottom, and everything in the finest order. I was young, strong, and athletic. I could drive ahead and work all day and stand guard half of the night through all kinds of weather. My pay for all this was the honour and trust reposed in me. To guard the president and leading men of the church was considered a great and mighty thing, and would not be exchanged by those holding that office for $10 a night. It was considered that this would qualify those performing that duty for any position of honour and trust. In 1845, I was present at a trial when 2 young men named Hodges were indicted and tried for murdering an old man and his wife. The Hodges said that Brigham Young had sent them to rob the old people of their money, of which they were supposed to have a large amount. When they went to rob the house, they found the inmates ready for them, and one of them was wounded. Thinking then that they would be detected, they killed the old people and robbed them of their money. One of the party became alarmed and reported on the 2 Hodges boys. Their older brother, Irwin Hodges, said that Brigham Young had gotten his brothers in this scrape, and that he could get them out of it, and that if he did not do so, his, Brigham Young's, blood would atone for it. The same evening, as Irwin was returning home, a little after dark, he was met by 2 men who had been waiting for him to come along. After some little conversation, as Irwin was turning, he was struck over the head with a police club, and then stabbed 4 times over the heart. The murderers then fled, supposing him to be dead. He was, however, only stunned, and the bleeding revived him. He ran about 150 yards and fell near Brigham Young's gate. He called for water, and also for Brigham to lay his hands upon him. Some person asked him who had done the deed. He replied he thought they were his friends, and expired without finishing the sentence, or he was afraid to tell. A neighbour came running to my house, knowing that Brigham was there, as he often came there to keep away from suspicious persons. I started home with Brigham, and while on the way, I remarked to him that it was a shocking affair. After a moment's hesitation, he replied that it was not any worse for Hodges to be killed than it would have been for him, young, to have his blood shed. This answer recalled to my mind the threat that Irwin had made during the day at the trial of his brothers, who were sentenced and hung at Burlington, Iowa. These men who turned away from the church were the most bitter enemies to Brigham Young and sought every opportunity to entrap him. They had a list of their most private friends to ensnare him and find an occasion to arrest him with a warrant. This caused Brigham Young to keep hidden as much as possible. In the meantime, his destroying angels were diligently on the watch, and every suspicious man was closely tracked up, and no strategy neglected to find out his business. If they were suspicious that any man wanted to serve a writ on his honour, Brigham Young, they were careful never to let that man escape. Sometimes they would treat them with great kindness, and in that way decoy them to some out-of-the-way place and save them, as they called it. They were not only on the track of officers, but all suspected characters who might come on to spy out what was going on. For instance, the consecrating of the stock of their enemies by the saints and driving it in at night and butchering it and distributing it among their friends. Joseph Smith, in his lifetime, said that a man who would steal from a Gentile would steal from his brother if he could not steal from anyone else, that he deprecated this petty thieving, and that the saints should wait until the proper time and then steal back the whole state of Missouri and get their homes back with interest. I knew of several men who were put out of the way in this manner, though I never saw any of them killed. Besides, there were enough willing tools to do all this kind of dirty jobs without me. Though it was entrusted to the police to do, they being sworn to secrecy. If any of them was caught in a scrape, it was the duty of the rest to unite and swear him out. It was claimed that the Gentiles had no right to administer an oath. I have heard men say they would swear a house full of lies to save one of the brethren. Whatever the police were ordered to do, they were to do and ask no questions. Whether it was right or wrong mattered not to them. They were responsible only to their leaders, and they were amenable only to God. I was a confidant among them, and they let me into the secret of all they did, and they looked to me to speak a good word for them with Brigham, as they were ambitious to please him and obtain his blessing. I knew that I was in their full confidence, and the captain of the police never asked me to do anything he knew I was averse to doing. Under Brigham Young, Hosea Stout was chief of police. they showed me where they buried a man in a lot near the Masonic Hall. They said they got him tight and were joking with him while some men were digging his grave. They asked him to go out with them into a pit of corn, saying it was fully grown. They told him they had a jug of whiskey cached out there. They led him to his grave and told him to get down there and hand up the jug, and he should have the first drink. As he bent over to get down, Roswell Stevens struck him with his police cane on the back of the head and dropped him. They then tightened a cord round his neck to shut off his wind, and then they covered him up and set the hill of corn back on his grave to cover up any tracks that might lead to his discovery. Another man they took in a boat about 2 o'clock at night for a ride. When out in the channel of the river, the man who sat behind him struck him upon the head and stunned him. They then tied a rope round his neck and a stone to the other end of the rope and sent him to the bottom of Mississippi River. There was another man, whose name I have forgotten, who was a great annoyance to the saints at Nauvoo. He generally brought a party with him when he came to the city and could threaten them with the law, but he always managed to get away safely. They, the saints, finally concluded to entrust his case to Howard Egan, a policeman who was thought to be pretty long-headed. He took a party of chosen men, or destroying angels, and went to La Harpe, a town near the residence of this man, and watched an opportunity when he would pass along. They saved him and buried him in a washout at night. In a short time afterwards, a thunderstorm washed the earth away and exposed the remains. They also told me of an attempt to rob an old man and one son who lived on the Bear River. Ebenezer Richardson, an old tried veteran and policeman, had charge of this mission. 4 of them went near the residence of the old folks. 2 of them went to the house to get lodgings and refreshments. The old gentleman told them that he was not prepared to entertain them and directed them to a neighbour who lived a mile away. They insisted upon stopping and said they were weary and would lie down upon their blankets. The fact was that the old man was suspicious of them and utterly refused to keep them. They then went away and counselled over the matter and concluded to wait until they were all asleep, then burst in the door before they could have time to resist. The old man and his son, being sure that they had come for the purpose of robbing them, had expected and were waiting for their return. Each of them had a gun. Richardson and his party waited until about midnight, when they slipped carefully to the house and listened. All was still. Then Richardson and another man burst in the door. As the robbers were in the act of entering the house, the old man and his son both fired. Richardson's arm was broken just below the elbow. The other man received a slight wound. The reception was rather hot, and they backed water and were glad to get away. Richardson wore a cloak to conceal his broken arm. The matter was kept a profound secret. I was in Brigham Young's office about this time. His brother Joseph and quite a number of others were present. When Brigham raised his hand and said, "I swear by the eternal heavens that I have unsheathed my sword, and I will never return it until the blood of the prophet Joseph and Hiram and those who were slain in Missouri is avenged. This whole nation is guilty of shedding their blood by assenting to the dead and holding its peace. Now," he said, "betray me, any of you who dare to do so." Furthermore, everyone who had passed through their endowments in the temple were placed under the most sacred obligation to avenge the blood of the prophet whenever an opportunity offered, and to teach their children to do the same, thus making the entire Mormon people sworn and avowed enemies of the American nation. They teach the rising generation to look upon every Gentile or outsider as their enemy, and never to suffer one of their number to be sentenced by a Gentile court. They have even gone so far as to teach them not to allow a Gentile judge to hang a Mormon dog, that they have no right to come into this territory and to sit in judgment upon the saints, that the saints are to judge the world instead of the officers of the world judging them. I once thought that I never could have induced to occupy the position that I now do, to expose the wickedness and corruption of the man whom I once looked upon as my spiritual guide, as I then considered Brigham Young to be. Nothing could have compelled me to this course save an honest sense of duty. I owe myself, my God, the people at large. So my brethren and sisters who are treading the downward path that will lead them to irretrievable ruin unless they retrace their steps and throw off the yoke of the tyrant who has long usurped the right of rule that justly belongs to the son of Joseph Smith the prophet. I have been driven to the wall by circumstances beyond my control and have been forced to resort to the first law of nature, self-protection. Perhaps this has served to open my eyes to a sense of duty. I confess I have been deeply steeped in fanaticism, even more so than I was aware of, until I felt the bitter pangs of its direful influence upon me. I heard Mother Smith, the mother of Joseph the prophet, plead with Brigham Young with tears not to rob young Joseph of his birthright, which his father, the prophet, bestowed upon him previous to his death. The young Joseph was to succeed his father as the leader of the church, and it was his right in the line of the priesthood. "I know it," replied Brigham. "Don't worry or take any trouble, Mother Smith. By so doing you are only laying the knife to the throat of the child. If it is known that he is the rightful successor of his father, the enemy of the priesthood will seek his life. He is too young to lead this people now, but when he arrives at mature age, he shall have his place. No one shall rob him of it." This conversation took place in the Masonic Hall at Nauvoo in 1846. Several persons were then present. In the meantime, Brigham had sought to establish himself as the leader of this church. Many years, however, passed away before he dared assume or claim to be the rightful successor of Joseph, the seer, prophet, and revelator to the church. When the time came, according to his own words, for Joseph to receive his own, Joseph came, but Brigham received him not. He said, as an excuse, that Joseph had not the true spirit, that his mother had married a Gentile lawyer and had infused the Gentile spirit into him, that Joseph denied the doctrine of his father, celestial marriage. Brigham closed the door and barred him from preaching in the tabernacles and raised a storm of persecution against him. He took Joseph's cousin, George A. Smith, as his first counsellor. He did as a matter of policy to prevent George A. from using his influence in favour of Joseph as the leader of the people, which he otherwise would have done. He also ordained John Smith, the son of Hiram the Patriarch, to the office of Patriarch to the Church, and his brother, Joseph F. Smith, to the office of one of the 12 apostles, thus securing their influence and telling them that had young Joseph been willing to act in harmony with them, the heads of the church, he could have had his place, but that he was too much of a Gentile ever to lead his people. Brigham said he had some hopes that David, a brother of young Joseph, when he became older, might occupy the place of his father. But Joseph never would. In this low, cunning, intriguing way, he blinded the eyes of the people and gained another advantage over them in establishing himself and family at the head of the church as the favoured of the Lord. Strange as it may appear, yet it is true, that many of these people are blind to the intrigues of this heartless impostor. They suffer themselves to be bound in fetters of bondage and surrender the last principle of manhood and independence and make themselves slaves to that corrupt usurper and his profligate family, who have robbed the fatherless and usurped the right to rule that belongs to another, and who has been trying to put his profligate sons at the head of this church to rule over this people. Now, let us for a moment divest ourselves of fanaticism, which is the result of ignorance, and look from the standpoint of justice and reason and compare the conduct and character of the two families. Young Joseph, the legal heir of the prophet, because he denies polygamy or celestial marriage, is accused of not following in the footsteps of his father, which Brigham says renders him unworthy to be a leader of this people. How much better is Brigham's son, John W. Young? He has followed in the footsteps of the prophet. Every one acquainted with his heartless conduct must answer no. On the contrary, he turned away the bride of his youth and his offspring by her, and also his other wives that were given him in the celestial order of marriage, and then took up with an actress from the stage, a woman not even of the faith of the Mormon Church. Notwithstanding all this, he is put forward by his father Brigham as his right-hand man to guide the destinies of the church and people. Oh, consistency, where art thou? And justice, where hast thou fled? Have this people lost their understanding? Does it require inspiration to detect the fraud and injustice at the bottom of this move? I think not. But it does require a great deal more fanaticism than I want to possess to shake me believe that God or justice has anything to do with it. I am honest in saying that it is from beneath, and none but a depraved, heartless wretch would stoop so low as to use religion as a cloak to dupe and deceive people. To accomplish so corrupt a purpose, he has robbed the rich and the poor of this people. He has made them pay tithes and tributes to himself. He has made himself rich and waxed fat until he really imagines himself to be the Lord's vice-regent here on earth, and that no one has the right to interfere with him. He is above the law. He is the Lord's anointed. O vain man, go hide thyself, and consider from whom thou hast received the succession, and through whose hard earnings thou hast been made rich. I must not forget to make mention of the qualifications of young Briggy, the son of the present leader of the church. He is considered by his father fully qualified to be his successor, to stand at the head of the church and lead the saints. This amiable son of the prophet Brigham, while on a mission to England, concluded that he would measure arms with Queen Victoria and the Prince of Wales by driving as many horses as she did to her carriage. This was a violation of law. The Queen very soon gave Prince Briggy to understand that she was the ruler of that kingdom, that it was his father could measure arms with the President of the United States. His son could not do so with her. Prince Brig was shut up in jail, and there he was to remain until the fine for his offence was paid. I have been told that $26,000 were paid from the Perpetual Emigration Fund for his release. This emigration fund is collected from the people for the gathering together of poor saints, but the liberty of this worthy young man was of more consequence than the gathering in of poor saints. Perhaps it is this ambitious act of the prophet's son that has qualified him to act as a leader. How does the character of Smith's sons compare with that of Brigham Young's sons? The one were peaceable, law-abiding citizens. The others are spendthrifts and ambitious, regardless of law or order, just like their father, full of self-esteem, miserly and bigoted. I remember 20 years ago, among the first members of the church, it was all the talk that young Joseph would soon take the leadership of the church as the rightful successor of his father the prophet. At that time, it never was thought that Brigham Young intended to hold the place permanently and establish himself and profligate family at the head of the church, as he has done, to make slaves of the saints, to keep and support himself and worthless sons. The saints have suffered themselves to be led step by step downward, lulled to sleep by false promises and phantoms that can never be realised. They are powerless, and having lost their self-control, they cannot resist the charms by which the serpent captivates his victims and holds them fast under his influence. Oh, that I had the power of speech to touch the understanding of my brethren and sisters, to wake them from the stupor and lethargy that has overcome them through the subtle cunning of the devil, that I fear has already made the bonds of many of them so strong they can never loose them. But I must stop and take a retrospective view of things in Nauvoo that I have not yet mentioned, trusting to my worthy friend Bishop to place these sentiments which I have just written in their proper place in my history. I have felt impressed to write them while I could do so, not knowing that I would have the liberty to bring up all the circumstances to that date. Mormonism Unveiled by John D. Lee, 1877. Read by Paul Martin, 2019. Copyright Paul Martin's Fine Films and Audio Books. Chapter 14. Inside View of Polygamy and the Doctrine of Sealing. In the winter of 1845, meetings were held all over the city of Nauvoo, and the spirit of Elijah was taught in the different families as a foundation to the order of celestial marriage, as well as the law of adoption. Many families entered into covenants with each other, the man to stand by his wife, and the woman to cleave unto her husband, and the children to be adopted to the parents. I was one of those who entered into covenants to stand by my family, to cleave to them through time and eternity. I am proud to say I have kept my obligations sacred and inviolate to this day. Others refused to enter into these obligations, but agreed to separate from each other, dividing their substance and mutually dissolving their former relations on friendly terms. Some have mutually agreed to exchange wives, and have been sealed to each other as husband and wife by virtue and authority of the holy priesthood. One of Brigham's brothers, Lorenzo Young, now a bishop, made an exchange of wives with Mr. Decker, the father of the Mr. Decker, who now has an interest in the cars running to York. They both seemed happy in the exchange of wives. All are considered aliens to the Commonwealth of Israel until adopted into the kingdom by baptism, and their children born unto them before the baptism of the parents are to be adopted to the parents and become heirs to the kingdom through the law of adoption. But the children that are born to parents after the baptism of the parents are legal heirs to the kingdom. This doctrine extends much further. All persons are required to be adopted to some of the leading men of the church. In this, however, they have the right of choice, thus forming the links of the chain of priesthood back to the father, Adam, and so on to the second coming of the Messiah. Time will not allow me to enter into the full details of this subject. The ordinance of celestial marriage was extensively practiced by men and women who had covenanted to live together, and a few men had dispensations granted them to enter into plural marriages, which were taught to be the stepping stone to celestial exaltation. Without plural marriage, a man could not attain to the fullness of the holy priesthood and be made equal to our Saviour. Without it, he could only attain to the position of the angels, who are servants and messengers to those who attain to the Godhead. These inducements caused every true believer to exert himself to attain that exalted position, both men and women. In many cases, the women would do the sparking through the assistance of the first wife. My second wife, Nancy Bean, was the daughter of a wealthy farmer who lived near Quincy, Illinois. She saw me on a mission and heard me preach at her father's house. She came to Nauvoo and stayed at my house 3 months and grew in favour and was sealed to me in the winter of 1845. My third and fourth wives were sealed to me soon afterwards in my own house. My third wife, Louisa, is now the first wife of D.H. Wells. She was then a young lady, gentle and beautiful, and we never had an angry word while she lived with me. She and her sister Emmeline were both under promise to be sealed to me. One day, Brigham Young saw Emmeline and fell in love with her. He asked me to resign my claims in his favour, which I did, though it caused a great struggle in my mind to do so, for I loved her dearly. I made known to Emmeline Brigham's wish, and even went to her father's house several times and used my influence with her to induce her to become a member of Brigham's family. The two girls did not want to separate from each other. However, they both met at my house at an appointed time, and Emmeline was sealed to Brigham and Louisa was sealed to me. Amasa Lyman officiated at the ceremony. At the same time, Sarah C. Williams, the girl that I had baptized in Tennessee, when but a child, at the house of William Pace, and who came to Nauvoo, stood up and claimed a place in my family. She is yet with me, and is the mother of 12 children. She has been a kind wife, mother and companion. By Louisa, I had one son born, who died at the age of 12. She lived with me about 1 year after her babe was born. She then told me that her parents were never satisfied to have one daughter sealed to the man highest in authority, and the other below her. Their constant teasing caused us to separate. Not as enemies, however. Our friendship was never broken. Her change made her more miserable than ever. After we got into Salt Lake Valley, she offered to come back to me, but Brigham would not consent to her so doing. Her sister became a favourite with Brigham, and remained so until he met Miss Folsom, who captivated him to a degree that he neglected Emmeline, and she died broken-hearted. Plural marriages were not made public. They had to be kept still. A young man did not know when he was talking to a single woman. As far as Brigham Young was concerned, he had no wives at his house except his first wife, or the one that he said was his first wife. Many a night have I gone with him, arm in arm, and guarded him while he spent an hour or two with his young brides, then guarded him home and guarded his house until 1 o'clock, when I was relieved. He used to meet his beloved Emmeline at my house. In the spring of 1845, Rachel Ann Dora was sealed to me, the woman who has stood by me in all my troubles. A truer woman was never born. She has been by me true, as I was to Brigham, and has always tried to make my will her pleasure. I raised her in my family from 5 years of age. She was a sister to my first wife. Her mother, Abigail Sheffer, was sealed to me for an eternal state. The old lady has long since passed away and entered into eternal rest and joy. But to resume the narrative of events at Nauvoo, in the year 1845 the building of the temple was progressing. Through the summer, trouble was brewing among all the saints, both in Illinois and Iowa. Many of my friends from Tennessee and some from Kentucky emigrated and joined us during that summer and fall, as well as some from other places. An effort was made to complete the Nauvoo house, if possible. But finding the storm approaching too fast, the work on the house was abandoned and all bands put at work on the temple. We were anxious to complete the temple in order that we might receive our promised blessings in it before we commenced our exodus across the plain in search of a home, we knew not where. Our time was limited, and our Christian friends who surrounded us, whose ire had been aroused to the highest pitch, were not likely to allow us to remain longer than our appointed time. The killing of the Smiths had aroused their friends to acts of violence, and many whose houses were burned and property destroyed, who had come to Nauvoo for protection and shelter, retaliated by driving in stock from the range to subsist upon. No doubt the stock of many an innocent man was driven away, and this served to bring others into trouble. Thus things grew worse the longer the saints remained at Nauvoo. It was an unfortunate matter, and much of the trouble that came upon the church was brought on through the folly and fanaticism of the saints. I have seen relentless cruelty practised by those who directed this cattle stealing. I cannot call it anything else, though they called it getting back what had been taken from them. It caused many strangers to come to the city to look for traces of their cattle. A company was organised called the Whittiers. They had long knives, and when any of these strangers would come to town, they would gather around him and whittle, none of them saying a word, no matter what question was asked. They would thus watch any stranger gathering close to him until they finally ran him out of town. I never took part in such low, dirty doings. I was taught from a child to respect all persons, as every spirit begets its like. I never did think any good came of such conduct. A man must respect himself, or he can never command others. During the fall of 1845, companies were formed for making wagons for the contemplated move. As a great many of the saints were poor and had neither wagons nor teams. Teams were more easily obtained than wagons. People traded off their lots and loose property for teams. Many of the wagons had wooden hoops in places of tyres for the want of iron, though iron and everything else was at the lowest price. Common labour was only 25 cents per day, but money was hard to get. About the 1st of December 1845, we commenced filling up the rooms for giving endowments. I assisted in putting up the stoves, curtains and other things. It was about 15 days before we got everything ready. I must mention that when the doctrine of baptizing for the dead was first introduced, the families met together down by the riverside, and one of their number, of the order of the Melchizedek priesthood, officiated. They were baptized in behalf of all they could remember, the men for the men and the women for the women. But when the fount was ready in the temple which rested on the 12 carved oxen, they went and were baptized in it after the same order, except that a clerk must make a record of it, and 2 witnesses must be present, and the name of the person baptized, and for whom he or she was baptized, and the date of baptism, together with the name of the officiating elder, and the name of the clerk, and witnesses, entered in the register or record. All persons who are baptized must also be confirmed. Male and female alike pass through the same ceremony, and the fact entered in the record kept for that purpose. This is done for all who have died without the knowledge of the gospel. As Jesus, while his body lay in the tomb, went and preached to the spirits in the spirit world the doctrine of his gospel to all who had died before hearing it since the days of Noah, so through baptism for the dead can our friends and those who have gone before us be made partakers of this new and last gospel sent to us, and receive its blessings and eternal reward. No person, however, is allowed the privilege of this baptismal font, or their washings or anointings, unless they have paid their tithings promptly, and have a certificate to that effect. In many cases, also, where men require it, their just debts must be settled before they are allowed to be baptized, washed, or anointed. In the order of endowment, a list is made out the day previous of those who wish to take their endowments. Every person is required to wash himself clean from head to foot, also to prepare and bring a good supply of food of the best quality for themselves and those who labour in the house of the Lord. In the latter, about 25 persons are required in the different departments to attend to the washing, anointing, blessing, ordaining, and sealing. From 25 to 50 persons are passed through in 24 hours. I was among the first to receive my washings and anointings, and even received my second anointing, which made me an equal in the order of the priesthood, with the right and authority to build up the kingdom in all the earth, and power to fill any vacancy that might occur. I have officiated in all the different branches, from the highest to the lowest. There were about 40 men who attained to that order of the priesthood, including the 12 apostles and the first presidency, and to them was entrusted the keeping of the records. I was the head clerk. Franklin D. Richards was my assistant clerk. My office was in room number 1 at President Young's apartments. I kept a record of all the sealings, anointings, marriages, and adoptions. I was the second one adopted to Brigham Young. I should have been his first adopted son, being the first that proposed it to him, but always ready to give preference to those in authority. I placed A.P. Rockwood's name first on the list. I also had my children adopted to me in the temple. Brigham Young had his children adopted to himself, and we were the only ones, to my knowledge, that had our children so adopted at the temple at Nauvoo. As time would not permit attending to all the people, the business was rushed through day and night. Officers were on the alert to arrest Brigham Young. He often hid in the different apartments of the temple. One day, about sunset, an officer knowing that he was in the temple, waited for him to come out as his carriage was waiting for him at the door. Brigham threw his cloak around William Miller, who resembled Brigham in build and stature, and sent him to the carriage with George D. Grant, his driver. As they got to the carriage, Grant said to Miller, "Mr. Young, are you ready to go?" As he spoke to him, the officer said, "Mr. Young, I have a writ for you. I want you to go with me to Carthage, 20 miles distant." Miller replied, "Shall I take my carriage?" The officer answered, "You may if you choose, and I will pay the bill." Grant then drove Miller to Carthage, and the marshal took him to the hotel and supplied him with refreshments. After supper, an apostate Mormon called in with the marshal to see him. When he saw Miller, he said to the marshal, "By heavens, you are sold this time. That is not Brigham. That is Mr. Miller." The marshal was a good deal nettled and said to Miller, "I am very much obliged to you." Miller replied, "You are quite welcome. I hope you will pay my bill as you agreed to do." "Why did you deceive me?" demanded the marshal. "I did not," replied Miller. "You deceived yourself. I said nothing to deceive you." "All right," replied the marshal. "I will settle your bill, and you can return in the morning if you choose." The friendly warning gave Brigham to understand that it was time for him to get away, that many such tricks would not be wholesome. In the temple I took 3 more wives, Martha Berry, Polly Ann Workman, and Delethea Morris, and had all my family sealed to me over the altar in the temple, and 6 of them received their second anointings. That is, the first 6 wives did, but the last 3 we had not time to attend to. On the 10th of February 1846, Brigham Young and a small company crossed the Mississippi River on the ice into Iowa and formed an encampment on a stream called Sugar Creek. I crossed with 2 wagons with the first company. Brigham did this in order to elude the officers and wait there until all who could fit themselves out could join him. Such as were in danger of being arrested were helped away first. Our police crossed over to guard the first presidency. Those who were not liable to be arrested remained back and sent their teams forward. I took one of Brigham's wives, Emmeline, in one of my wagons, with Louisa, her sister, as far as Florence or Rainsville. All of Brigham's wives, except the first, were taken by the brethren, as he did not at that time have the teams or means to convey his family across the plains, but was dependent on the brethren for help, though he had used every means in his power to raise an outfit. Brigham called a council of some of the leading men. Among them was one Joseph L. Haywood and myself. Haywood was a merchant at Quincy, Illinois, and was doing a fair business before he joined the Mormon Church, and was considered an honourable man. When the Mormons were driven from Missouri, many had occasion to bless him for his many kindnesses to them in their hour of trouble. At the council, after some conversation upon our present move, Brigham proposed to appoint a committee of men against whom no charges could be brought, to return to Nauvoo and attend to the selling of the property of the saints, and to see to fitting out the people and starting them forward. He proposed that I.A.W. Babbitt, Joseph L. Hayward, and David S. Fulmer be that committee. Brother Hayward was asked to turn over his whole stock of goods to fit the first presidency, and the apostles for the journey. This to Brother Hayward was a stunner. He replied that he was indebted to honourable men in the East for the most of his stock, and that he did not dare to defraud them, that he had been taught from childhood to deal honourably with all men. He was that he could raise the money to pay his East creditors from the sales of the property at Nauvoo. This Brother Hayward thought very doubtful, as the property of a deserted city would not be very valuable. Brigham then said that this was a case of emergency, and they must have the goods, that Brother Hayward must write to his creditors and tell them that owing to the trouble among the people's business had fallen off, and that he could not pay them, but would in the future. Brigham told him if he failed to raise money for the sale of city property as soon as the church was established, that he would raise the money for him to satisfy his creditors, and this would give him more influence than ever among the outside world. They finally persuaded Hayward to turn over his goods. If time permits, I will hereafter tell how he came out of the matter. For all of my services for the leading men, I never received $1. I have managed, however, to maintain my family in good style, to pay my tithing, and live independently of help from the church. I was called a shrewd trader and a good financier, and always had plenty. I usually had some money on hand. These were considered by Brigham noble traits in my character. He would rather a good person would give to him than beg from him. Mormonism Unveiled by John D. Lee, 1877. Read by Paul Martin, 2019. Copyright Paul Martin's Fine Films and Audiobooks. Chapter 15. The Saints Move Westward. A few words in regard to the prophet Joseph. He was tried 21 times for different offences, acquitted each time. One time, when he was visiting at Peoria, he was captured by 4 men from Missouri, who started with him in a wagon to take him to that state. 2 of them sat beside him with cocked pistols, punching him in the side occasionally and telling them that if he opened his mouth, they would blow his brains out. He was not arrested by any process of law, but they were trying to kidnap him. Stephen H. Markham, an old friend of Joseph, ran ahead to the town of Peoria, employed a lawyer, got out a writ of habeas corpus, and had him set at liberty. When the news reached Nauvoo, the saints were in the wildest state of excitement. The Mormon steamer there was laden with troops who hastened to Peoria to rescue the prophet. When they arrived there, they found him at liberty. This was in 1843. The same winter, he organised what was called the Council of 50. This was a confidential organisation. A man by the name of Jackson belonged to it, though he did not belong to the church. This council was designated as a law-making department. but no record was ever kept of its doings, or, if kept, they were burned at the close of each meeting. Whenever anything of importance was on foot, this council was called to deliberate upon it. The council was called the Living Constitution. Joseph said that no legislature could enact laws that would meet every case or attain the ends of justice in all respects. As a man, Joseph tried to be a law-abiding citizen, but he had a motley crew to manage, men who were constantly doing something to bring trouble upon them. He often reproved them, and some he disfellowshipped, but being of a forgiving disposition, when they would come back to him and beg his forgiveness, his kind, humane heart could not refuse them. He was often basely imposed upon. I was standing with him one cold day, watching a couple of men who were crossing the river in a canoe. The river was full of ice, running swiftly. As they neared the shore, the canoe upset, throwing them into the river. One of them got on a cake of ice, but the other made several attempts before he could do so. As quick as though Joseph sent a runner to them with a bottle of whisky, saying, "Those poor boys must be nearly frozen." "This man Jackson was standing near," said he. "By heavens, he is the most thoughtful man on earth." On another occasion, on the 4th of July 1843, at a celebration, a number of toasts had been offered, when someone said, "Brother Joseph, suppose you give us a toast," raising his wishing that all the mobocrats of the 19th century were glass, with water in it. In the place of spirits, he said, "Here in the middle of the sea, in a stone canoe with an iron paddle, that a shark might swallow the canoe, and the shark be thrust into the nethermost part of hell, and the door locked, the key lost, and a blind man hunting for it." But to return to our expedition across the plains, the snow lay about 8 inches deep on the ground, with the first company crossed the river. The plan of operation was this: we must leave Nauvoo, whether ready or not. All covenanted to help each other, until all were away that wanted to go. The teams and wagons sent to help others away were to be sent back as soon as a suitable place was found at which to make a settlement, and leave the poor, or rather those who had no teams to go on with. I was unwilling to start out with a part of my family, leaving the rest behind, and thought that now was the time to get them out before greater trouble commenced. I went into Brigham's tent and told him what I thought of the matter, and that I thought I could fit up teams in a few days and bring them all away. He replied that he had been thinking of the same thing. Said he, "Go, I will give you 5 days in which to sell out and cross the river again, and bring me $100 in gold." I informed the portion of my family that was with me of my intentions. My first wife was still at Nauvoo. I had the confidence of my family, and I was a man who seldom undertook anything that I did not carry out. I started back on foot and crossed the river on the ice. I fell in with acquaintances about La Harpe, who were in trouble about a number of wagons and teams which they had purchased in the state. The devil was to pay generally, some of the Gentiles who had lost cattle laid it to the Mormons in Nauvoo, and they were determined to take cattle from the Mormons until they got even. I had a brick house and lot on Parley Street that I sold for $300 in teams. I told the purchaser that I would take 7 wagons and teams, and before I went to sleep that night, I had my entire outfit of teams. My large house costing me $8,000 in Salt Lake City, it would have been worth $50,000. I was offered $800 for it. My fanaticism would not allow me to take that for it. I locked it up, selling up only one stove out of it, for which I received 8 yards of cloth. The building, with its 27 rooms, I turned over to the committee to be sold to help the poor away. The committee informed me afterwards that they sold the house for $12.50. I was sitting with my family and was telling them that I must get $500 in some way, but the Lord opened no way by which I could see where I could get it. And I had but 5 days in which to get out of Nauvoo. In an adjoining room was an old gentleman and his daughter who rented the room of me. They were from Pennsylvania, and the old gentleman was wealthy. The daughter stepped into her father's room and soon returned, saying that her father wished to see me. I went into his room. He gave me a seat and said, "You once did me a kindness that I have not repaid. Do you remember meeting me once when coming from the temple? I had been there with my wife, an only child, to get my washings and anointings. I was not admitted because I was a stranger and no one to vouch for me. I was returning with a heavy heart when I met you. You returned with me and used your influence, vouched for us, and procured our admittance. I obtained our endowments. I had a cancer on my breast at that time that was considered incurable. From the hour I received our endowments, it has never pained me, and it is healing up. Now I am thankful I have it in my power to do you a little favour in return." So, saying, he lifted the lid of a box and counted out $500 in gold coin, saying that if it would help me, I was welcome to it. I offered him a team, but he said he had money enough to buy his outfit and support him while he lived, and that he felt thankful for an opportunity of returning my favour. This was to me an unexpected blessing from an honest heart. I wept with joyful gratitude. I had the means that I desired in my hands. The next morning I received my teams and wagons. All had to be fitted up for the journey. My family all went to work making tents and things needful for the journey. I sent my wagons to the Mormon wagon shop and told them to work night and day and put them in the best order within 3 days, and I would give them $50 in gold, which was $5 for a day and night's work, quite a difference from 50 cents, the usual price. They went to work in earnest, and as fast as a wagon was finished, I had it loaded. In the meantime, A.W. Babbitt was urging me to cross the river as there was an officer in town looking for me. On the 3rd day I started one of my ox team across the river on the ice and came near losing the whole outfit. By its breaking through the ice, I crossed no more teams that way. I then got a large wood boat and some 25 men to help me, and we cut through the ice across the river so that the boat could be towed over. On the fourth day, I had all of my effects at the riverside. The day before, when I had crossed the team that had broken through the ice, I met an officer at the riverside looking for me. He wanted to arrest me on the charge of lascivious cohabitation, having more wives than one. I told him that I had seen John D. Lee crossing the river the day before, and that one of his oxen broke through, and added that it was a pity he had not broken through also. I stepped into a saloon with the officer, and we took a drink together. I then went with him into the wagon shop, and stepping in ahead of him and tipping the wink to the men there, said, "Have any of you seen John D. Lee today? Here is an officer looking for him." They replied that he had crossed the river the day before. This satisfied the officer, and he went away. I bought oils and paints for my wagons and 5 gallons of whiskey to treat the boys who had helped me over the river. As we left the river, a heavy storm came up. It was so dark I could see nothing. I had 4 mule teams and let them follow the road. We halted about a mile beyond the town of Montrose, and a man who lived there named Hickenlooper took us all in and attended to the animals. I went to sleep and did not wake until 10 o'clock the next morning. This man had all the supplies we needed, flour, bacon, etc., and I purchased my store of supplies from him. I learned that the company had moved on and was camped at a place called Richardson's Point, 45 miles from Montrose, before reaching the encampment. I was met by Brigham Young, H.C. Kimball, and Dr. William Richards in their carriages, who bade me welcome. After we reached camp, a council was held, and I reported my success and gave an account of my mission. When I had finished, Brigham asked me if I had brought him that $100. I replied I had, and handed it to him. He counted it, and then said, "What shall I do with it?" I replied, "Feed and help the poor." He then prophesied, saying that I should be blessed, and means would come unto me from an unexpected source, that in time of needs, friends would be sent to my assistance. The roads were in bad condition, and we lay here a few days, during which time I painted and numbered my wagons. Myself, George S. Clark, Levi Stewart, and another man were appointed hunters. As there was much game in the country, we had to pass through turkey, deer, and some elk. From here we travelled to the Raccoon Fort of Grand River in Iowa, about 75 miles. At the 3 forks of the Grand Canyon, we made a halt. In fact, the rain had made the country impassable, and our provisions were running short. Here we found some wild hogs, and the men killed several. Brigham said that they were probably some of our hogs that had become scattered when we were driven out of Missouri. This was sufficient license for many to kill anything they could find. While we lay here, 2 men came to our camp, named Alan Miner and Mr. Clancy. They were traders to the Potawatomi Indians. Alan Miller had married one of my wives. They informed me that we could get everything we needed about 50 miles from there, near Grand River, We unloaded about 17 wagons and selected out such articles as we could spare. I was appointed the contracting commissary to do the purchasing for the companies. This was in April 1846. We started with those 2 men and the 17 wagons and drove to Miller's and made that headquarters, as he had provisions in abundance. The grass was like a meadow then. I had some horses and harness to exchange for oxen and cows. When we had turned out our stock for the day at Miller's, Mr. Clancy invited me home with him. On entering his house, I found his partner, Patrick Dorsey, an Irishman, sick. Mr. Dorsey had been tormented with a pain in his eyes, insomuch that he had rested neither day nor night, and was losing his sight. I asked him if he was a Catholic. He answered that he was. I knew their faith, as I was raised a Catholic, and once believed in their doctrines. I asked him if he wished me to pray for him. He inquired if I was a minister, to which I replied that I was. He then said, "Do pray with me, if you please, for I am in great distress." I then laid my hands upon his head and asked the Father, in the name of the Son, and by virtue of the holy priesthood in me, vested, to stay his suffering and heal him. The pain left him instantly, as he took this hat and walked with me to Miller's house. They were astonished to see him apparently without pain, and asked him what I had done for him. He answered, "I was in great distress. A stranger laid hands upon my head and prayed and made me whole. But who he was, or whence he came, I know not. But this I know, that I was almost blind, and now I see. I was sick, but now I am well." This little occurrence created quite an excitement in the settlement, and nothing would do but I must preach the next evening. During the next day I made several trades. Evening came, and I preached at my friend Miller's. When I closed, they made me up a purse of $5 and offered to load one of our wagons with provisions. We remained here about a week and did finely in trading. On Sunday, quite a large attendance for a new country turned out to hear me preach. I was weary and did not feel much like preaching. However, I preached about an hour and a half. At the close of the service, they made up $10 for me, and a Mr. Scott, a wealthy farmer, said that if I would drive my wagons to his establishment, he would fill them all with flour, bacon, potatoes, etc. I had the use of my friend Miller's store to store away our traps, as I had more than we could take away. The people were anxious for me to stop there and take up a farm, make my home with them, and preach and build up a church. I told them that I was bound for the Rocky Mountains. As for Mr. Dorsey, he offered me all he had and wanted to know what to do to be saved. He gave me a history of his life. He told me he led a company of men from Carroll County, Missouri. When we were driven from the state, I reflected a little and gave him a list of city property at Nauvoo that I would turn out to him at 1/4 its value for such property as he wanted to turn out to me. He said he had 12 yoke of oxen and some 25 cows and other stock, 4 bee stands, 3 wagons, some $600 to $800 worth of bacon, flour, meal, soap, powder, lead, blankets, 30 rifles, guns, knives, tobacco, calicos, spades, hoes, ploughs, harrows. Also 12 feather beds, and all of his improvements. He said he wanted his carriage and a span of black horses to take himself, wife and partner to Nauvoo. All the above property he turned over to me, and I gave him deeds to property in Nauvoo. He was to go back with our return teams as Brigham had commenced making a settlement at the place where he was camped. He called the place Garden Grove. We returned to camp, laden with all our teams could haul, besides the free wagons that I had got from Dorsey. There was a great deal that we could not move away. I took a 40-gallon cask of honey and a quantity of whisky and brandy from Dorsey. The bee stands, improvements, and farming utensils I turned over for the use of the settlers that remained at Garden Grove. The circumstances confirmed me in my oft-expressed opinion that much of the trouble that has followed this people has been created by wild, ignorant fanatics. For only a few years before, these same people were our most bitter enemies, and when we came again and behaved ourselves, they treated us with the utmost kindness and hospitality. I also made arrangements for all the labour needed by the company that was left, so that they could be planting crops and raising supplies while building houses to live in. The company left would be strengthened by others who would follow. All the borrowed teams were returned to bring others forward, and those who had teams of their own went on and made another settlement called Pisgah, and then went on to Council Bluffs, which was afterwards called Canesville, in honour of Colonel Thomas L. Kane. From this point, I took a cargo of traps consisting of feather beds, fine counterpanes, quilts, and such goods, and went down to Missouri with a large number of wagons to obtain a cargo of supplies and beef cattle and cows. During my absence, a call was made on the Mormons for 500 men to go to Mexico to defend the American flag. Colonel Ethan Allen and Thos L. Kane came to raise the required number of men. An express was sent back to Pisgah and Garden Grove to furnish their number. The ranks were nearly full before I reached camp. Dr. Richards said to me, "I am glad you have returned. We want you for one of the captains." "All right," I answered, and started to enrol my name. Brigham Young called me back and said he could not spare me, that there were men enough to fill the bill without me. The battalion was filled, and Colonel Allen, a United States officer, marched them to Fort Leavenworth, Kansas. From Council Bluffs, I returned to Missouri to buy a drove of cattle for Brigham Young. Dr. Richards and others, they having received some money from England. I also loaded some 20 wagons with provisions and articles for trade and exchange. I also exchanged horses for oxen, as the latter were low and the former high in price. About the middle of August I returned with about 500 head of cattle. While I was gone, the camp had moved across the Missouri River at a place called Cutler's Park. The cattle swam the river, but the provision train was still on the Iowa side of the river. A. Grant and some other of Brigham's men, teamsters and waiters, crossed back for a couple of loads of provisions for Brigham and some others. Without saying a word to me, they loaded up from the train their supply of provisions. When I heard of it, I was considerably ruffled, as this train was in my charge, and I was responsible for it. I went to Grant, who seemed to be the leader, and told him he had not acted the gentleman in interfering with what did not belong to him. We had some warm words, and had not other parties interfered, we would have come to blows. He justified himself by saying that Brigham sent him. I told him I did not care who sent him, that there was a right way and a wrong way of doing things. The feeling grew bitter between us, and they accused me of doing many wrongful things in my office. Finally, Brigham called us all together in the presence of the First Presidency and the 12 Apostles, and we made our statements. My accusers said what they had to say, and then I replied. When Brigham had heard our statements, he reproved my accusers sharply and fully approved of all I had done. He then said we must not have any ill feeling and directed me to shake hands and be friends. I was the first that arose to comply. We shook hands, and though we agreed to drop the matter, still the old spirit lingered, even after we had crossed the plains